what he's trying to do is fashion a new doctrine, and I think he would call it the doctrine of restraint, not isolationism. And if you think about it and step back a little bit, what he's doing is he's pulling a Bill Clinton, which is a third way, triangulating between, in this case, Obama and Cheney to a certain extent, saying, and I think the key line in what he wrote here is, strength doesn't mean you always have war.
America loves a good argument. We're drawn to verbal fights between people faster than we're drawn to offers of 10-cent cheeseburgers. But members of the Republican Party seeking to get back into complete control come 2016 are not all thrilled with a snarky spat going on between two of their top contenders for the presidency. That and much more. Let's welcome into MidPoint Republican strategist, pollster, president and CEO of the polling company. She has worked with such notable politicians as Fred Thompson, Jack Kemp, Mike Pence, Newt Gingrich. Kellyanne Conway joins the fray. Kelly, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Ed.
Kelly, let's start out with a really simple question. Why is Rick Perry being so mean to Rand Paul?
Oh, I think Rand Paul is a big boy. He can take it, and he has acquitted himself very well on this very issue this week. I like when Republicans strike back at each other because they're supposed to be the pro-competition, pro-free market party, and that should extend to its exchange of ideas and certainly its elections. But Rand Paul did not allow Rick Perry's presumptions that he's an isolationist and charges that he's the wrong way on foreign policy. Rand Paul did not allow those to go unanswered. He went to Politico and wrote an op-ed in response and essentially said, look, I, Rand Paul, believe that the first duty of this nation, of the federal government, is to protect the nation, and that includes having armaments, that includes having a well-heeled military. What he doesn't support is going back into Iraq, is sending our sons and daughters to war. He says the bar for sending our sons and daughters into war ought to be higher. And I think if people are just going to throw around pejoratives like isolationists, then they really ought to reevaluate and listen very closely to Rand Paul saying. I think the fear for many neocons and many establishment Republicans is frankly that the public is more on the Rand Paul side of foreign policy than on their side.
Is it fair to say that Rand Paul is taking great advantage right now of the big government look at President Obama right now, and that specifically is where his foreign policy is based, in direct opposition to that entire big government scene?
Well, perhaps. It definitely is in opposition to what the president has done in Syria. For example, Senator Paul makes clear that he would stop arming the rebels in Syria, and that Governor Perry, whom I like very much and respect as governor of Texas, he didn't even address that in attacking Rand Paul's foreign policy. And so Senator Paul says he would not be arming these rebels in Syria, and that he would make sure that ISIS, which of course is spreading across Iraq now, stops also. And he just feels that we spent a decade, to read his words, we spent a decade arming or training the Iraqi military, and when the enemies came, they basically took the uniforms off and laid down their arms. So when 71% of Americans tell the NBC Wall Street Journal pollsters that they think the cost of the Iraq war was too high, at least somebody needs to articulate that. Whether they're right or wrong, that's the way they feel. That's their opinion, having lived with the Iraq war for over a decade.
Kellyanne, is there a feeling, and I get this from talking to some friends of mine in the party and out of the party as well, people who look at strategy, there seems to be a feeling that there are some people who feel that Rand Paul is an easy target and they can go after him, and this guy maybe does not want to fight back as much as others might expect. But aren't they really underestimating him in many ways?
Well, I would underestimate Rand Paul at my peril. I think the guy is going to go farther and faster than people realize for any number of reasons. I mean, frankly, he and Elizabeth Warren are going to have a very similar populist, libertarian reach to organizations and individuals who don't necessarily support your party type of message. Rand Paul's message is just right and Elizabeth Warren's is wrong. But it's a very similar outreach. On this matter, I think that Politico put it best when they called it the Rand Paul pile-on, showing how many Republicans came out of the woodwork to go out of their way to attack him. And I thought it was pretty impolitic of them to do it, but again, it shows their fear of his possible reach. I think he's organizing in all these states, and he is hiring some really great talent in some of the earlier states in Iowa and New Hampshire. He's done that recently. And I just think after you've beaten the establishment the way Rand Paul or Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio or Mike Lee have done, you're less afraid of the establishment. You really don't owe them anything. They were against you winning in the first place. You beat them handily. And this is a man who very much believes in his message. But I think to dismiss anybody as an isolationist or as a Tea Party Republican or as a pro-life zealot done by another Republican is really poor form.
He's really more an anti-interventionist, isn't he, at this point?
Well, I don't know if he's anti-interventionist is probably more accurate if you read his words than, quote, isolationist. By the way, I don't think a U.S. Senator, let alone a President of the United States, could be an isolationist if he or she wanted to. And clearly, Rand Paul does not want, and none of us want to be isolationist. But non-intervention really means let's think this through before we go and get involved in every single skirmish. I actually think Rand Paul's major opposition here is starting to be Senator Marco Rubio. So Governor Perry got into the fray, but Marco Rubio seems to follow the John McCain, Lindsey Graham wing of the Republican thought right now in terms of intervention. And Rand Paul is out there with his own set of thoughts, just basically echoing what many Americans say, which is, look, we have a primary duty to protect ourselves and our borders and our security. But should we be involved every single time with armaments, with troops on the ground? That's the whole point. He says that the bar should be higher before we send our sons and daughters to war. Many Americans agree with that.
If we look then at what Rick Perry is doing right now, is this dangerous for Rick Perry? And also then, in your opinion, what does this do to split the party as these two are constantly fighting? Because as we hear Perry, he talks and speaks out against isolationism, takes that complete isolationist shot at Rand Paul. Disheartening to hear fellow Republicans such as Rand Paul suggest our nation should ignore what's happening in Iraq. I mean, he's gone off on these and other diatribes. How dangerous is it for him and for the party?
Well, first of all, Rand Paul is not ignoring what's going on in Iraq. I can't imagine who in the Republican Party is. But
other than Rick Perry, who thinks that he's ignoring it. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's unfair to say that anybody's an isolationist or ignoring it. It's unfair. However, I actually applaud the Perry-Paul split because it's the strength of a diverse party. It's the strength of a party that welcomes all kinds of thoughts. I mean, Ed, could you or any of your viewers name for me 5 prominent pro-life female Democrats in this country? Probably not. 4, 3, 2, 1. You can't name any. The boll weevil Democrats, the pro-life Democrats, mostly the pro-Second Amendment Democrats, the blue dog Democrats, they've been driven from the party. That party is really very myopic in its ideology and its exchange of ideas. The Republican Party, on the other hand, is very diverse in its exchange of ideas, and I think the Rick Perry, Rand Paul dust-up over foreign policy is the latest example of that. I feel like it should be welcome because the Republican Party too often talks about the silly electability. Who can win? Who can win? And of course, those people who can win, Bob Dole, John McCain, Mitt Romney, all lose. The question is not who can win. The question is who can lead. And the sub-question is, how do Republican primary and caucus voters and the broader electorate surely define leadership? They don't know what electability is. They shouldn't much care. But they know leadership when they see it and when they don't. And I welcome a full exchange of ideas like the one we're having right now in foreign policy.
Well, let me stop right there. I was going to go on to young conservatives and libertarians here, which are apparently Rand Paul's base, and see what else he gets. But wait a minute. You hit foreign policy here. There are those who are saying, forget the economy, stupid. Really, what will happen come 2016 is that foreign policy trumps everything when it comes to electing presidents, and that's why this is so important. Would you agree or disagree?
Yes, and that I do agree that foreign policy would be an incredibly important issue. It always is, even if it doesn't show up in the polls at more than 3 or 4%. That doesn't mean Americans don't care about it. It means that when asked in a poll, Americans responded the way you asked them to respond, which is what's the most important issue to you and your family, or what's the most important issue for Congress and the president to address. And there you see the economy, #1, jobs, somewhere around there, but healthcare on the rise because of Obamacare, and even education, particularly for women, on the rise. But foreign policy is a congenitally important issue to Americans, particularly to early voters in the Republican primary and caucuses. Why? Because we're nothing if we're not protecting ourselves. People, there, to go back to an earlier question you posed, Ed, is exactly in opposition to what's happened during the Obama years. I mean, for God's sake, what exactly is the Obama doctrine? Can anybody tell me what that is? And so if you think about the Obama doctrine and you think about the weakness in foreign policy, the fact that we are not respected around the world the way we once were, and the fact that the president himself doesn't seem much interested in this, quote, concept of American exceptionalism, there is an opening for a strong, robust, unafraid leader in the Republican Party to come forward with their own view on foreign policy. It is going to be an important, but it's also wrapped up in border security, it's wrapped up in terrorism, it's wrapped up in our standing in the world, and it's wrapped up in, I want to make this very clear, if you look at the polls, it's also wrapped up in something fairly new to the American public, which is the price tag of all this intervention worth it. People are looking at that through green eyeshadow, not just through a security equation.
All right, then 10 seconds. Rick Perry, Rand Paul. Who's winning the battle now in public opinion?
They both have their adherents, no question that there are people, the classic neocon Cheney view of foreign policy is the Rick Perry view. And then Rand Paul is really tapping into a nerve among many Americans, not all of just whom are under the age of 30, by the way, who are fatigued by war and intervention and want to see us step back a little bit from that.
There you go. Kellyanne Conway, an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Let's do it again real soon.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Still ahead, why is there some serious shaking in the cartoon boots of the folks at several major amusement park companies today? And this is not just the Disney folks as well. It's coming up right here on MidPoint, where every day we question everything.